Prior to the release of The Chronic, Suge was shopping around the album for distribution. Originally, the album was to be released through Sony, but due to the quote-unquote crazy things going on around Death Row and Dr. Dre's sticky contract situation with Ruthless Records, it was a no-no, and they kept shopping around to different distributors and would be faced with the same fate every time, as no one wanted anything to do with them due to their contractual problems with Ruthless, until they went to Interscope Records and had Jimmy Iovine hear the album. Now, Jimmy Iovine loved the record and really wanted to work with Dr. Dre, so it was on. Jimmy Iovine helped legally finalize Dr. Dre's contractual release from Ruthless, and the album was to be distributed by Interscope Records. Now, one thing that we have to absolutely give Suge Knight credit for is setting the terms of the agreement, which was that they, as Death Row, would keep the masters, otherwise known as the master recording, as he understood, like Dr. Dre's previous situation, that they were not going to settle for them doing all of the work and them taking the money. And because Jimmy Iovine desperately believed in Dr. Dre and his talent, he had no choice but to agree. 1993. By 1993, The Chronic was a major success, and now Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre were gearing up for the release of Snoop Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style, which would drop on November 23rd. The album was a major success and outperformed The Chronic, eventually going quadruple platinum. Snoop Dogg case. August 25th, 1993, amidst the creation of Doggy Style, Snoop Dogg and his bodyguard Malik were involved in a deadly shooting of an alleged rival gang member named Philip Waldemariam. The story was that they had gotten into a verbal dispute while Snoop Dogg was riding around with his bodyguard in a Jeep. It appeared to be some rivalry taunting, and the exchange started to escalate on Waldemariam's end, where he brought out his weapon aiming to fire it towards them, and Malik quickly reacted in self-defense and shot him before he can shoot them. Waldemariam ended up passing due to the injuries he sustained. Now, Snoop wanted to turn himself in right away because he thought that it was the right thing to do. He knew he was innocent and wanted to clear the air on how the situation went down. And I mean, of course, the longer you wait to turn yourself in on something like this, the guiltier you appear. Snoop let the label know what happened, but Suge advised that he stayed low for a couple days because within a week he had the MTV Music Awards to promote the upcoming album, Doggy Style. Now, in Suge's mind, at the end of the day, Snoop had a job to do and had to be the artist first and promote his upcoming work. So they took a risk and he went to the awards. Now, obviously, getting there, the police were posted up and ready to take this man to jail, but they agreed to make this as graceful as possible. Snoop would go on stage to present the award and exit stage left quietly to be taken under custody. And that's exactly what they did. Arrested with both his bodyguard and an associate by the name of Sean Smith. Snoop would soon be released one day after posting $1 million bail, courtesy of Suge Knight. Now, this arrest in many ways was disheartening and distressing for Snoop, because at the time he thought about making it out of the hood just to have the possibility of everything that he worked for stripped away in an instant. That thought in itself was very difficult to bear, a story that by now we are very familiar with. Luckily, by 1996, both him and his bodyguard were acquitted on all charges. 1995. By 1995, Death Row Records was on top of the globe despite the increasing criticism of gangster rap music by the mainstream media, politicians, and academics. Death Row had multi-platinum releases of albums like The Chronic, Doggy Style, and the duo Dog Food releasing the Dog Pound under their belt. And by this time, they have shaped the sound of West Coast rap and solidified themselves as the biggest and most successful label in the West Coast. Unfortunately, however, for every success came with its equivalent pitfall. Tupac Shakur. The major success in this case was getting into business with Tupac. Tupac signed to Interscope Records back in 1991 and had already released 3 albums with the label prior to any contact with Death Row Records. By 1995, Tupac was serving time at the Clinton Correctional Facility, and I'm not going to go too deeply on the case, but he was serving time on sexual abuse charges due to an incident with then at the time 19-year-old Ayanna Johnson. He was, however, acquitted on all other charges. According to Wikipedia, quotes, by October 1995, pending judicial appeal, Shakur was incarcerated in New York. On October 12, he bonded out of maximum security Dannemora Clinton Correctional Facility in a process of appealing his conviction. One Suge Knight, CEO of Death Row Records, arranged for posting of his $1.4 million bond, end quote. At this time, Tupac was in financial ruin. Even though Interscope had advanced him about $600,000 in the 9 months of his time behind bars, he created a hole for himself financially, because as you know, artists don't always recoup royalties until months or even years down the line. And as we all know, an advance is a loan, not to mention his treatment in prison had broken him mentally with the constant humiliation and the threat of his life, to the point that he agreed to quote-unquote sign a deal with the devil. Now, there's been a misconception that Tupac directly signed to Death Row Records, or that Suge directly bonded him out. However, that wasn't the case. Now, Suge did show interest in Tupac 2 years prior, and that's when Tupac started to slowly evolve into being more of a thug, owning that part of his personality, and started to get into a lot of legal trouble. His legal expenses started getting very high, and Suge saw that as his way in. Suge even paid him about $200,000 to record and write the song Pour Out a Little Liquor from the Above the Rim soundtrack, a movie that Tupac was starring in, with the soundtrack produced by Death Row Records, which also, by the way, ended up being on Tupac's project, Thug Life Volume 1 in 1994. Now, Suge had then even offered to sign him on to Death Row Records, but Tupac had declined. Now, how Suge actually bonded Tupac out of prison is as follows. The parent company of Interscope, who Tupac was signed to, was Time Warner. And due to all the heat in the press at the time, and that includes censorship groups and activists for the genre of hip-hop being quote-unquote promoted, as well as the nature of Tupac's case with the assault, they wanted to cut ties, aka it was bad publicity. This meant that Tupac was not receiving any financial support. Now, Suge wanted Tupac on his label for a couple years now, and Interscope was feeling the pressure of Time Warner to essentially shed him. So Interscope started applying pressure to have Tupac link up with Death Row to create some distance. So long story short, on September 16, 1995, while he was in prison in Dannemora, Tupac signed a 3-page handwritten memo drafted by Death Row attorney David Kenner, which would give him $1 million cash advance, plus some other cash for other expenses in exchange for his next few albums, and would allow David Kenner to represent him and Suge to manage him. This was definitely a big conflict of interest, because David Kenner was Suge's attorney, but also Death Row's attorney, which you guys could do the math on, equaling potentially big trouble for Tupac. Now, it's been said that he's been given a verbal release from his Interscope contract, but nothing at least that I can find where it was written on paper. However, this little memo and the way that David Kenner and Suge handled Tupac was definitely unethical and at worst illegal. But I think Delray Richardson can explain it better.
Tupac was in jail. He was in a desperate situation. And like I said, he was signed with Interscope, if you remember. So when they went to get Tupac out of jail, if you look at that, it wasn't a contract that he signed. That was like a deal memorandum, if you will. And it was deal points as to what would be included in a contract had he signed with Death Row, and they actually wrote up a contract, and that was supposed to be in it, and that was the language in the agreement. But the first thing that he had signed was, it was a letter to Interscope, basically explaining that David Kenner and Suge Knight would be respectively Tupac's lawyer, David Kenner and Suge Knight would be his manager, letting Interscope know this, right? Now, at that time, Tupac signed to Interscope. So first and foremost, you would need to void out the Interscope contract in order for Tupac to sign with Death Row. And so when you see and look at that contract, that's not what happened. So basically, it was a tentative agreement on what Death Row and Suge Knight was supposed to do. But first and foremost, it was ripe with a conflict of interest. And the conflict of interest is this. David Kenner was Suge Knight's lawyer, and David Kenner was also the lawyer for Death Row. And then he would now be acting as the lawyer for Tupac. So if there were anything to go on, how would anybody's rights, mainly Tupac's rights, be protected? They couldn't be. There was a conflict of interest. Who are you going to look out for? The label and the CEO? Or are you going to look out for the artist?
The only reason Tupac signed this memo was because he was behind bars and basically had no other option. Clearly, he knew better, hence having refused to sign prior, knowing that Suge was bad news. But nonetheless, within a week, Suge miraculously got the bail money, which totaled $1.4 million. The bail had three components. One, $850,000 was posted in the form of a corporate guarantee by Atlantic Records. Two, $250,000 posted by Interscope, and the remaining $300,000 was posted in the form of a bail bond. And this would be paid by Tupac in future royalties. Well, clearly this wasn't Suge's money. Where I do give credit to Suge is that if it wasn't for him actually being the middleman and doing the legwork, Tupac might have not gotten out in that time. But the distinction here is that it was label money, not Suge's money.
It's the Warren G. Seen a car full of girls, ain't no need to tweak. All of you search know what's up with 213.
First of all, I'd like to thank God. Second of all, I'd like to thank my whole entire Death Row family on both sides, you know what I'm saying? I'd like to tell Tupac to keep his guards up. We ride with him. And one other thing I'd like to say, any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing. Come to Death Row.
Declaration of war, East Coast versus West Coast. On August 3rd, 1995, Suge Knight threw jabs at Diddy and Bad Boy Records while showing his allegiance to Tupac as he was in prison at the time, which most people would say was the starting point of the East Coast versus West Coast beef, or what perhaps solidified the beef. The year before, November 30th, 1994 to be exact, Pac got robbed and shot 5 times in the elevator on his way to Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan, New York. Now, Pac has claimed that he was set up by Biggie and the Bad Boy Camp because that was the studio Biggie was working out of, and the song Who Shot Ya just happened to come out a couple days later, even though the song was clearly recorded months before. But we could see through that dramatic incident, Pac was on defense mode, did the math, and assumed that it was them who set him up. However, later, Biggie and Diddy would publicly deny those claims, and it was an odd thing because prior to that, Pac and Biggie seemed to have a solid relationship, but nonetheless, it was on site ever since. 1996. By 1996, Death Row Records was making well over $100 million a year. Tupac dropped All Eyes on Me, which would be his 4th studio album executive produced by Suge Knight. Unfortunately, it would also be the last album he would drop in his lifetime. All Eyes on Me dropped on February 13th, 1996, and a little over a month later, Dr. Dre would leave Death Row to start Aftermath with Jimmy Iovine. And Dr. Dre didn't just leave Death Row Records, he left his masters behind. And why did he make that decision to leave, and leave without his masters at that? For one, it started in 1995 with Dr. Dre having a stint in jail for about 8 months after breaking probation of a previous conviction, which I won't go into detail about, but rather driving under the influence. In that time, it gave Dre time to reflect on his life and his decisions, and he came to realize that the environment he was in was unhealthy and wasn't conducive to where he wanted to be, considering all the violence he's witnessed and had to turn a blind eye to. Like, for example, seeing an engineer getting the brakes beat out of him for rewinding the tape too far. And we can assume much more that he hasn't spoken about publicly. And it has been alleged that another reason why he left is because Miss Chalet, his longtime on and off girlfriend from the NWA days, who was also signed to Death Row, got with Suge. All in all, the common theme here was Suge, and he didn't want to have to deal with the crap that came along with working with him. And we know Suge Knight by now. We understand that a lot of Suge Knight's business dealings were very unprofessional. It came with a lot of intimidation and at times just ruthless violence. So he preferred just to leave empty-handed without his masters if that meant leaving in peace. Now, the manner of which Suge obtained those masters is up for debate. Whether or not Dre gave those up willingly or not can be speculated, but one thing we do know for sure is that Suge was going to have his way no matter what. The death of Tupac Shakur. Now, we all know by now about Tupac's untimely death on September 13th, 1996. According to an article from XXL magazine, quote, he was hit outside the Las Vegas Strip after attending the Mike Tyson Bruce Seldon fight at the MGM Grand Hotel and Casino. Pac had been riding in the passenger seat of a BMW sedan driven by Death Row CEO Suge Knight when a car pulled up to Knight's sedan right side, rolled down a window, and rapidly fired gunshots at Shakur. At around 4:03 p.m. on September 13th, Tupac was declared dead after his body started hemorrhaging blood and doctors were unable to stop the internal bleeding. His mother, Afeni, ordered the doctors to stop after the blood loss became too severe, and Pac was soon declared dead after living 6 days in a medically induced coma. The official cause of death was noted after an autopsy as respiratory failure and cardiopulmonary arrest in connection with multiple gunshot wounds. After the autopsy, Tupac's body was cremated the very next day. He was 25 years old, end quote. This point in time marked the fall of Death Row Records. The star of the label had just passed, the heart of the label just left months prior, and the head of the label, Suge, months later on February 28, 1997, would be convicted of parole violation and sentenced to 9 years in prison. And at that point, Interscope dropped the distribution deal and other artists were leaving in droves like Nate Dogg, Snoop Dogg, Corrupt, Daz Dillinger. What was once this empire that couldn't seem to fail despite the lawsuits, controversies, and violence was finally meeting its inevitable doom. And despite Suge's effort to keep things in motion behind bars, it would never be the same. By 2006, Suge Knight and Death Row Records would declare bankruptcy, and we later found out that artists were owed millions of dollars. But we will leave it at that in terms of the end of Death Row, but shout out to Snoop Dogg, who earlier this year became the new owner. Final thoughts: the fall, Suge Knight. Now, there are several pieces to the story that caused the fall. For one, it's the lawsuits from the violence and intimidation tactics that occurred in the early years, which, by the way, was allegedly sanctioned by Suge Knight for the most part. And it's a laundry list of those acts that I couldn't mention, otherwise this video would be 4 hours long. As well as unpaid royalties. We could also say it was the artists going in and out of jail, not to mention the death of one of their bigger stars. But at the heart of this, it was Suge Knight, the now former CEO. And the reason why I blame Suge Knight is because he was the head of the label, and if the head ain't right, nothing else will work out. And I mean that literally and figuratively. He created an environment of hostility and violence, got drunk off of the power and money. But I must give credit where credit is due. He had the drive and the intellect, and had the potential to be one of the greatest music execs to have ever lived, and some may argue that he still is. But either way, it is tainted with the lives lost in the process, the manner in which he got the job done. I mean, he did a lot of good, like giving back to the community by hiring people from the hood who came right out of jail, but it would be offset by them doing his dirty work in terms of intimidation, threats, and sometimes violence. It was impossible for him to keep the streets and his business life separate. It was intertwined right from the beginning, like in the alleged manner of how he got Dr. Dre and the other artists out of their ruthless contracts. There was no way that Death Row under Suge Knight's leadership would have thrived long term. Violence and hostility is not a sustainable way to keep things running, and it all eventually came back to haunt him, and in the worst way possible. Not only did he lose everything in terms of money, but he lost his freedoms in the process. The lesson here is that the energy you put out will always come back to you, and that no one man will reign supreme forever. So be careful how you treat the people on your way up, because on your way down, no one will blink an eye when you lose everything. Night section out.